Medicine,
Law, friendship. This is Dr. Long and Lawyer Nik. You're listening to the Medico-Legal Brief.
one doctor, one lawyer, and a whole lot of gray area. Hi, Nick. Long time no see.
Hey, Long, how's it going?
Good. It was nice seeing you in person this last weekend. Great short visit over to Texas. Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, I think we mentioned this in another podcast, but Long lives in Wisconsin. I'm in Texas. So Long still has family down here. So every now and then he gets to come visit and grace us with his presence. So
Yeah.
it was a good time.
Well, it was really cute watching you guys, interact with my two kids while you guys are expecting your newborn soon later this year. So it was really nice to watch you be a dad.
Yeah, we're expecting a girl in the fall, and Long has both a boy and a girl. So we got to play with both of them, but I was trying to take notes on what it takes to be a girl dad, and that was pretty interesting. She's got a personality on her,
Oh, yeah. Very independent.
very independent. Other than
Well,
that, you had a safe trip back?
yeah, absolutely. Just had a 1 hour layover, but just as kids are, 2 hour flight, so it wasn't terrible. But
Yeah.
yep.
So when you're here, what's the thing you miss most about Texas besides this 100-degree heat and weather?
Obviously my friends and family. I feel like my core group is in Texas,
Mhm.
but when we go back, we always go for the food. I mean, the food, the access to barbecue, the access to Tex-Mex, and even Asian food in Texas is just a little different than up here in Wisconsin.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it different or is it better?
Better.
Better.
I didn't want to say that outright, but no, it's better. It's better.
I think it's one of those things where in Texas, we have a great barbecue scene. But if you go to Nashville or Tennessee or North Carolina, South Carolina, they'll argue that their barbecue is better because it's comparable, but it's a different type of barbecue. So it still
Exactly.
might be good. But then you go to someplace else, you're like, okay, that's not real
Yeah.
barbecue.
Yeah. No, here we usually just do home cooked meals. We don't really go out that much because, I mean, the food seems good. It's
No.
okay. Especially if you're into like bars, beer,
Mhm.
cheese, those things. It's the
Yeah.
stereotypical things that you would think of for Wisconsin are
Yeah.
actually pretty good. But if you want like a hearty, good Asian meal, we usually do it.
Nice. And your parents will cook you meals as well while you're here, right?
Yeah. So my mom spoils me. She treats me like I'm still a kid when I go home. She'll do my laundry. She'll, like fold it and she'll ask like a week ahead of time, ask for like a menu. She'll,
Yeah.
she'll ask for requests and she says, okay, what do you want for this week? And how many days of the meal do you want? And she'll make it all and prepare it all. Yeah. I get really spoiled when I come home. And then of course she gets to spend time with the grandkids and she spoils them.
Do you get to bring any of the food home or is that too hard to travel with?
No, there are some things. So there are some things that if I can freeze, I can sneak it. Well, not sneak it, but I can do it on a checked bag and bring
Yeah.
it home.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
We're just waiting for you guys to come visit us soon, eventually.
As as soon as my wife pops out this little kid, and we can start traveling again. I don't know what the rules are as far as being pregnant and traveling. And I don't think, she's in her second trimester, so the last thing that she wants to do right now is get on a plane, but she's feeling a lot better than her first trimester. So
No,
yeah,
this is the prime time to travel because then it's like, yeah,
that's really
the
good choice.
likelihood of anything happening is probably minimal, but you maybe 2 to 3 months
Mhm.
before baby's due, that's probably when you would want to stay home.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the first trimester, that's up to how she's feeling. And obviously, she didn't have the greatest times.
No, she did not. That's so true. She did not have the greatest time. Well, Long, we can start getting into it for today. I think we have a
Yeah.
pretty interesting discussion point, which is the difference between the corporate world and private practice. And I think that expands throughout law and medicine. And I think we'll be going over some of the similarities and some of the differences.
Yeah, exactly. I think there will be a lot of similarities for sure, but the idea is to go through, pros and cons of either avenue. And with our individual experiences, I think you've mostly done private, right? Because your first
Yes.
lawyer, attorney that you worked for was a private.
Mhm.
And I've been purely corporate, but I've looked into private and heard a lot about different models of private practice for family physicians. Excited to kind of get into that.
Yeah, that's very similar to kind of what I was looking at because in previous podcasts we mentioned I did an internship at American Airlines, which is corporate, and then I worked for this aerospace defense company in a non-lawyer capacity, but I also got to see the corporate enterprise there. And there are times where I even thought about trying to apply to the legal department and going over and being an in-house counsel, and then kind of venturing down that path. I had discussion points with other lawyers within the company, and it's different. It's different. And then there are definitely some pros and cons.
Did you ever consider going private, early in your career at all?
I was never looking to hang out my own shingle. It was something to where my interests, we had discussed that I was looking at possibly going to the FBI or going into another government agency. My interest was never really in trying to hang out my own shingle. As I've gotten older, though, and I've kind of been more established in my career, there are instances in which I've thought, okay, well, if I want to go start my own firm, my own private firm, what would I want to specialize in? What would I want to do? What kind of life or work would that entail? And there are definitely different benefits to doing that, but there's also a lot of risk to doing that. And I think that happens in any sort of private practice. So we can get a little bit more detail about that here in a little bit. But with it, you look at the private practice and you look at the risk there and you look at the corporate world, there's different work-life balance. There's PTO, there's benefits, there's the type of people that you work with. A lot of private practices, at least in the law world, they don't have HR departments because they don't have enough people to have an HR department. So the rules kind of turn into the wild, wild west at times when it comes to your benefits and your pay time off and even how people speak to each other. Because it's not like you can go to an HR department and complain that you had been disrespected or anything of the sort. So I'm interested to know if medical is similar to that.
Absolutely. And for obviously private practice in medicine, you're looking at limiting how much of your expenses that you're putting out so that you can bring in the most income, right? So there's always that balance. And so if someone's starting out hanging their own shingle, then they're going to try to cut out those unneeded things. So obviously there's not going to be an HR, discuss PTO, all those things in the contract. They're still going to have contract just like a corporate world, but it may look a little differently. But I feel like the way we should flow this conversation is maybe start back in like law school and medical
Yeah.
school. Is there a push or maybe a narrative of like the professors that you interact with? Do they suggest or push you towards private or push you towards corporate? Like what's it like there, the community in the law school?
That's a perfect question, and I agree with you on the discussion point of how we get there. So when you're in law school, you're basically deciding what your career is, and there's already these pathways that exist. You can go corporate and go be in-house counsel for a company. You can go work for a private firm, and that firm can be really, really, really small, or it can be very, 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 very big. There are some firms that aren't necessarily considered corporate firms, but they're still big law in the sense that they do big cases and they have a big caseload and they have a lot of attorneys. But as you get into those bigger law firms, it starts to feel more corporate. More rules are solidified. You have benefits, you have HR departments. So although you're not necessarily in a corporate sense being in-house with like a true corporation, the big firm can feel more corporate. But what ends up happening is you can pick these paths, and that's not to denote the fact that you have other pathways that might be going to a public defender's office, going to go work for the state as a prosecutor, doing other jobs that may not be legal in the sense of a legal career, not illegal jobs, but a legal career job.
Good clarification.
Yeah, it's needed sometimes. You never know. But one of the biggest points is that somehow as an attorney coming out, you have to learn how to be an attorney. You have to learn how to actually be a lawyer because I've mentioned before, law school teaches you how to think like a lawyer. It teaches you how to argue like a lawyer. It tries to teach you the case law and the statutes. But as soon as you graduate and you pass the bar, you're kind of stuck as to, okay, how do I actually do this? So there are people that are very, very business savvy that will come out and say, I'm just going to open my own firm. And what they do is they, just like you would start a small business, they go out, they get a PLLC, so a professional limited liability. And then from there, they will start marketing themselves. They'll buy the billboard, they'll buy the radio ad. They'll start doing things in which it's called getting on the wheel. And so you can go into a courtroom, like for family law, if you were on the wheel for family law, essentially if something came up where maybe somebody needed to be represented, like a father needed to be represented, or it was a pro bono case, like the judge could go down the wheel and say, okay, this person needs to work, so I'm going to assign this case to this person. And I've actually been in a courtroom where I walked in and the judge said, hey, this person needs representation because he had, in this case, he hadn't paid child support. And in the state of Texas, if you don't pay child support, it's actually a jailable offense. So because of that, you need representation, right? So it was, hey, Nick, you're going to be this person's attorney. And at that point, I wasn't even on the wheel. I was just assigned in the middle of the courtroom. But those people starting the private practice, they'll find a way to get the work so then they can start growing their practice, growing their client base. And then from there, it's kind of, okay, are you doing a good job? Are you checking and adjusting? Or did you do something to get disbarred within the first year and now you no longer practice? But that's definitely extreme.
Yeah. You feel like in law school, your professors, like, was it the consensus, oh, everyone's expected to go into corporate and some of them may break off into private? Or was it more like, hey, it's equally applicable. You can go either route.
It's 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 equally applicable because the professors aren't necessarily the ones that are pushing you in a direction. They all have their unique experiences where they may have worked in big law. They may have worked for a corporation. They may have had their own practice. They may have never practiced a day in their life and they went straight into the academic world as a professor. What you do get though is you do get the individuals who work at the school as almost like career counselors that try to push you in the direction that fits your interests. Because the other important thing about law school, at least from a statistics point, is being able to find employment. Because there are stats that say, okay, out of law school, if you go to this school, here are the stats on what your employment rate is likely to be. And here are where all of our people are going. And that's a data point. You know, if you are a law school that's very, very good at pushing out big law lawyers or federal prosecutors, when people are entertaining the law school that they want to go to, they may look at that school and say, all right, if I want to be a federal prosecutor, that's the school I need to go to because that's the direction that most of their students end up in. So that's very important, but it's usually career counselors that work with you. By the time you're in postgraduate, you're kind of treated more like an adult than when you're in your bachelor's program. And everybody tries to guide you into what they think you should do and they throw internships at you and you're just trying to figure it out. But yeah, did that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I mean, just to kind of bring it into the medical side, obviously in medical school, that's not even anything we're thinking about. I think for us, our goal is just to pass classes, pass the tests, get our actual doctorate degree before we even consider, are we going to go corporate, are we going to go private? Once you get into residency, that's usually when you kind of have that discussion or you start seeing more on both sides because it's very convoluted, but there's corporate, there's private. However, within corporate, there are different sectors, right? So the academic sector, considered corporate, but it pays differently. There's different benefits when you work in the academic side. There's different benefits when you work for a nonprofit community hospital system versus a for-profit system. So those are all kind of like breakdowns within the corporate side. But ultimately, the two big umbrellas are corporate and private. And in medicine, it's actually heavily geared towards corporate. Like you're kind of expected, or that's kind of the expectation is that when you come out as a surgeon, when you come out as a family physician, OBGYN, like you're going to go and work for a big health system that's already established out there. And I think the reason why is private practice used to be a big thing, especially in primary care, right? Especially with family physicians. They would just open up their own office and see patients, you know, the day after they graduated residency. But to get there nowadays, the cost is so high. That's a huge barrier. And then on top of that, you have to consider most medical students graduating medical school are usually graduating between 300 to 350,000 dollars in debt, and that's on average. And then you're going to go through 3 to 7 years of residency and fellowship when you're not paying down your student debt, so it only balloons even further. So a lot of people are, you know, 400, $500,000 when they finally get out and start as a true attending.
Yeah.
So those are barriers to private practice. But the funny thing is nowadays, I think politically, socially, it's kind of pushing back towards that. So even though in school, in the actual academic centers, they're not pushing you to go private, but once you come out, the public is pushing physicians more, or at least what's happening in society. It's pushing physicians to want to do more private. Yeah.
That makes sense. Now, to bring it back to the barrier, because I feel like that is something that any entrepreneur has to face, whether they are a true entrepreneur in the sense of starting their own business or they're a doctor or a lawyer. You're about to start your own business, your own company, and there's a lot of initial investment that needs to take place. So from a lawyer perspective, right? Okay, I need to buy the building or I need to rent the space. I need to buy the office equipment. So I'm looking at a desk and I'm looking at printer and computer. I may need to hire an office manager or a secretary or a paralegal. Then on top of that, you need to pay utilities. So you got the overhead of the space. But you could also do it kind of cheap when you're starting out, where there's no requirement that you have office. I've heard stories of people coming out to where they would have their meetings just at like a local coffee spot where they would meet their clients and they would go home and all the work would be done from their kitchen table because the practice of law is, can you fill out the paperwork? Can you show up at court? Can you do the documentation? Can you submit it via the appropriate channels, whether you're e-submitting it or you're going up to a courthouse to hand it over to a clerk? Like those are different instances of private practice that you can literally do from anywhere. So I think that there might be a lower barrier to entry than medical. What kind of things would you need to invest in if you were going to do a private practice coming out of, I guess, the medical schooling?
Yeah, I mean, you've kind of hit the nail on the head there with how you can do the bare minimum and start from scratch, right? So, as a physician, you can do telehealth, telemedicine. So, everything is online nowadays. It's harder to start out with. You have to be very savvy with technology, with social media, advertising. But like I was saying, where the landscape is kind of shifted back towards private, even within the private sector, it has segmented out into these different categories of types of private practice, right? So you can go your old school building, office, you have one or two rooms that you see patients in. You have a medical assistant or a secretary. They usually are a single person if you're starting out because you want to try to maximize efficiency. You want to make sure that you have tables like patient tables that you examine patients on, otoscopes, ophthalmoscopes, stethoscopes. You have to have the most expensive thing when you start out is probably the building that you're paying rent for, but also the EMR, right? So the electronic medical record. Nowadays, it's required that you have some way to maintain patient files in a HIPAA compliant way. And so that is a lot of money to maintain. And if you're a small practice, it's hard to find a system that flows well with your workflow, but also does what you are needing it
Uh,
to do. Yeah. So that those are other barriers. But again, I wanted to kind of branch into these other types of private practice models. So you have the old school route, you have the concierge medicine, right? So that is where you're at the becking of your patient. They pay you a certain amount for the whole year, and they basically are saying, hey, you are the family doctor, and if we need you for anything, you are ready there to answer your phone and answer any questions that we may have. You tend to think of concierge medicine as folks who are handling more celebrities, people who can actually afford like an in-house doctor almost. But there's a newer model called the DPC model, and that's called it's the direct to patient care. That's basically where you do a subscription model. So very similar to concierge, but it's more affordable for just the day-to-day patient. So you are paying a monthly amount, whether that's $50, $60 a month, and any amount of time you want to see the physician, they are there to answer your questions, to review things with you. And so that is another easy way to jump into that private model because you can do that with literally just one room in a building somewhere. You can rent it out of another friend's office building, a dentist's office building, like anywhere. As long as it's one private room, you can then start seeing patients. So that is another way to kind of break down that financial barrier. And people are more willing to pay, subscription models. Like, oh, yeah, I'll pay $50 to test you out as my doctor for a month. And so that's kind of the new up and coming type of medicine. The nice thing about DPC is you completely cut out insurance companies altogether. And that's a whole nother headache
yeah.
of a topic, right? You can go private practice and you can continue to utilize insurance, or do you not utilize insurance? And if you do utilize insurance, then you're going to definitely need an accountant to kind of hash out through like the prior authorizations. There's just so much behind the scenes that I feel like a lot of people don't realize and understand. But yeah, so private practice is absolutely something that is still, I think, is slowly going to come back into the mainstream eventually, especially for primary care physicians.
Yeah. So, question for you, because obviously patient and client confidentiality is super, super important. But there's a different dynamic, I think, when it comes to a medical office as opposed to a law office, is how clean everything needs to be. Sanitation, you don't have to worry about that at a law office. You try to have a bathroom for people to use when they're there and just a comfortable place to sit. But there's no requirement that your office needs to be the cleanest thing on the planet. So when you're in private practice, do you need to have those considerations in the same way like maybe a restaurant would have requirements and certifications to make sure that they're meeting that standard? Do you have to have a similar standard for your own private office?
No, there is not like a federally mandated like quality of office that you need to
Okay.
maintain. Like your example of a kitchen or restaurant, yeah, there aren't. Fortunately, unfortunately, we don't have those requirements. However, you're still selling a product to the patient. So if a customer comes in and they see that your office and your patient room is just a mess, they're not going to want to come back. Or if they notice that every time they come to your office, they leave feeling sick a week later,
Mhm.
then
Yeah.
hey, maybe it's not clean enough. So there are standards, unspoken standards, but
Yeah.
good question.
Yeah, that's always very interesting because sometimes, I mean, I've been in offices where you go in and you're kind of like, this is the cleanest doctor's office I've ever been in. And there are other times when you go and you're like, I'm going to be sick just sitting in this waiting room. And again, like you said, individual will decide whether or not they return to that place of business, just like you would a restaurant. But I was interested if just if there was like a standard that by law or what have you that you'd have to meet to, because you're dealing with cleanliness and not getting people sick. I think about the sanitation, for the needles and so on and so forth. Like if there's requirements that you have to meet to discard of those, etc.
Well, I mean, of course, there's that standard.
Yep.
Usually, you have to. I mean, but that I think is in general. Like you want to be throwing needles in your regular trash can. You want to make sure you put it in like a milk carton or something. So I kind of wanted to flow to the next question that I had is how would you compare private and corporate in terms of benefits and pros and cons of going into private practice versus staying in corporate?
That's a very good question. And I think that one thing I may have forgotten to do is like define in the law what corporate is. Because there's a sense of when you say I'm going into corporate law, is that you're actually going to be in the legal team for a corporation. So you might go to Toyota or AT&T or Coca-Cola and you will be part of their in-house legal counsel team. And that's part of going corporate. So you have your private practice, which can be you hanging out your own shingle, and then you could be at a small firm, which is still private, or you can be at a bigger firm, which is still private, a little bit more corporate in its ideology, right? I'm not familiar, and I can't really speak on it as to whether there are law firms that are also considered corporations, like in the same sense that you would consider a Coca-Cola a corporation. But the bigger law, they can still be private firms. They have the name on the door and they can still have benefits and PTO and HR departments. But when you define corporate law in the sense of, hey, I'm going to go into corporate law, it's usually you're trying to be an in-house counsel at like American Airlines. So there's kind of a few different steps. I'll start with the true corporate law aspect of I'm going to go be in-house counsel at a corporation. Usually when you're there, you are treated just like any other employee within that corporation. So you're held to the same standard from an HR perspective, from a benefits perspective, et cetera. So I'm going to use American Airlines again. You might be a lawyer for American Airlines, but you are treated the same way that the supply chain manager for American Airlines is treated. Other than the fact that like you have different job duties and your salary might be slightly different, but usually the benefits that are accessible to you are the same. Unlike private practice, where if you have your own firm or you're at a small firm, you don't have the benefits package. You don't have 401k. You usually don't have health benefits or health insurance. PTO, as we've discussed in other podcasts, gets a little different because you don't have a solidified, hey, you have 2 weeks off or you have 40 hours of sick time. It's more, can I take the day off tomorrow or I have a vacation in a few weeks? So those are kind of some pros and cons from a corporate law perspective. The hours from a corporate law are also more solidified. So you might just be working 40 hours a week or 50 hours a week or your basic salary work time. At a private firm, there may not be the typical 40-hour weeks. You might be spending your weekends working. You might also not even work a full week because as you're starting out for your own firm, you may not have that much work. You might just be searching for work. So you might only work 20 or 25 hours a week, and that's that. And then that middle area with these mid-sized firms, larger firms, by going into those areas, you might have billable requirements. So now you have to work a certain number of hours per week. So those are some of the main differences. The other kind of wild difference I don't think a lot of people understand is that in working for a corporation, a lot of times the legal work is actually outsourced. So, for example, let's say that company A wants to sue company B for something. Well, the lawyers at company A aren't going to be the ones that actually file the lawsuit. Company A will actually go out and hire big firm C to file the lawsuit against company B. So then they will hire a lawyer team to actually go out and do the legal work. So the lawyers in the corporate law perspective are more so as an advisory role or handling areas of compliance, making sure that you are adhering to employment law, compliance within your industry, being able to determine HR issues, or just advising if you're at a financial institution, advising appropriately on like the rules within the SEC and finance. So it's a lot of differences that can take place, but you're more of an advisor in the corporate law sense than you would be at a big law where you're actually probably more boots on the ground.
Yeah, actually, what you just described is actually what the lawyer that works for my health system introduced himself and explained what he does, exactly what you explained. So it's kind of cool to actually like put a role to an actual explanation.
Yeah, their position is to protect the company. Well, when you work for the company, they'll protect you. But if you do something that's detrimental to the company, they will either be there in a sense to defend you against whatever detriment occurred, or they might distance themselves from you saying, hold on, wait, that's not what our company stands for. So a lot of employees for a corporation will say, oh yeah, we got lawyers that'll help us. Like, no, that's not your lawyer. That is the company's lawyer. Company can use that lawyer as they see fit.
Yeah, yeah, and I actually want to give an example of that. So, as a working physician, when I was working for the actual employer, so my this was my previous job. If we were to get a letter from a patient asking us to fill out something out for an injury they had or a motor vehicle accident, saying I got a disability from this, we can ask the lawyer, hey, are we obligated to fill this out? And they would advise us, okay, yeah, you can, or no, you shouldn't, or maybe you should only give this amount of information. But that same lawyer, once I put in my notice, treats you a little differently now. Now you can go and ask them questions, but they're not really going to give you the answers that you want to hear. They're going to try, like you said, distance themselves. And again, because their role is not to protect you, the employee, it's to protect the company itself. So I had that firsthand, and it's crazy that you brought it up, and then I was able to kind of tie it together there.
Yeah, it's very interesting because as soon as you are leaving a company, lawyers, all we think about for the most part is liability, right? And how to minimize risk, minimize liability. So they'll do debriefings, they'll do exit interviews at a corporation for any employee. And it's okay, when this employee leaves, are they going to cause issues? Are they going to come back and have complaints? Are they going to come back and sue the company? Are they going to claim wrongful discrimination? Like, wrongful termination. There's so many different things that you now have to start building a wall against that employee, depending on the terms that they're leaving on. So that it makes sense that the distancing occurred because now they're worried about you in the sense of you had a great career there, but now are you going to be a liability for the company? Because you no longer owe the company anything because you're not employed there.
Yeah. Yeah, great points. I think from a medical standpoint, your pros and cons list very similar. The only nuance differences are going to be things that we deal with in terms of types of patients, right? So in a private practice, you get to choose your patient. They come in, you don't like them, you can tell them, hey, we're not a good fit, you leave. In a corporate world, you see every single patient that walks through your door and you treat them similarly. And if you were to fire a patient, whether that's from non-compliance or poor behavior or just them not treating you or your staff well, you have to go through this whole arsenal of admin, right, to get that patient actually fired. So there's a lot more hoops to jump through. Whereas private practice, you're your own boss, you get to decide. The insurance aspect, private practice has the opportunity to deal with insurance. Everything can be cash pay. Everything can be, in a different pay scenario. Whereas in a corporate role, majority of the time, it's all through insurance. So you're dealing with prior authorization, a lot of the paperwork behind the scenes. So those are, you know, cons. The reason I personally prefer corporate medicine is because I don't have to worry about keeping the lights on. Like I get to go to work every single day, know that I'm going to have patients to see, that I don't have to go out and find these patients. All I have to do is just show up, bring my knowledge, and be a good physician. So that I feel like that is such a luxury sometimes, especially when there's so much stress at home, so much stress in other areas of your life, that's the last thing I want to deal with. And I know the type of person that I am. I'm type A, and I know you are type A, that if I were to open my own practice, I would be nitpicking every little detail, right? Like if we're trying to cut costs here, you bet I'm going to be cutting. Okay, the lights better be on and off at this minute, this second, so that we're not losing any pennies there. So I think opening a private practice it's for a very specific type of person, but it does take a lot of sacrifice. You do have to have a lot of savings and be able to take a hit, usually 6 months to a year, sometimes even longer,
Yeah.
to build up a client base, a patient panel that's enough to sustain the amount that you want, right? And then again, of course, the benefits are also very different. You'll still get PTO, you'll still get healthcare from a private standpoint, but it's not going to be as strong of a package as if you were to get at a corporate. And then if we're talking about like patient coverage, calls, obviously, if you're a solo doc and you're taking call, you're the only person taking call, so you're going to be on call all the time. Versus a system where you've got 100 physicians, then they're all going to take turns taking call. So other things to keep in mind, when you decide corporate or private.
Yeah. Now that kind of piqued a point in my head. So one thing that, because my mentor coming out of law school was amazing. Like she is still a very very close friend, a very good mentor. And one thing that she did was she sat me down and she tried to give me not just the legal training, but like the life and business training about how to be business savvy. And this is going to lead into a question for you, but it was just her firm. It was her and an office manager. I was the first associate attorney that she hired. And we sat down and she actually went through the math of how much I cost her every single year. So it was, hey, you have this salary. And although I'm not giving you benefits, right? I'm not paying for the benefits. I'm paying for your bar membership every single year. I'm paying for your certain transportation, paying for filing fees for us to do our job. Your office has this much space and it takes up this much overhead. And so you don't cost 50, 60, 70, $80,000. You actually cost me 110, 120, $130,000. That's why you have billables measured against your performance, because you need to bring in money to cover that cost. So I don't lose money in hiring you as an associate. So we've talked about us starting our own firms and what that's like, but I think another aspect of it is growing the firm and bringing on help in the form of associate attorneys or other doctors. So from a private practice perspective, is that something that also occurs where you have your own private practice and you bring in other physicians underneath you to grow the practice?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, um, any company, any business, if you grow enough and you have enough clientele and patients that you have to expand, you have to expand, right? You have to meet the needs of your clients. And so, yes, if you open a single physician clinic, and then in 5, 6 years, now you are what, 2, 3,000 patients in, and you just feel like you need a second person, you bring a second person in. Very similar type of talks. You talk about how that new person can bring in revenue, but then the different thing in private practice is usually when you're joining a private practice, there's always a discussion about becoming partner in that
Yes.
practice. Because you want to have more in the game so that you can put more into the business. Because otherwise, if you're just another employee, you may not be as dedicated.
Now, and I'll go over the legal aspect of it. What does it mean to become a partner from a physician standpoint at a practice?
I'm not too familiar, but from my understanding, it's so when it's all said and done, the owner will have his Excel sheet, right? And or his or hers Excel sheet, and have the overall income of the business and then subtract all the expenses. And then whatever's left over is the profit that they get to keep. So when you become partner, you are then that second person that gets to sit down with that Excel sheet and determine, okay, how are these profits going to be split, right?
Yes.
It's usually going to be split evenly. And so that's kind of what my understanding of becoming partner in a private practice would be.
Now, and you may or may not know the answer to this because this happens in the legal world. Do you have to buy in to becoming partner?
Yes, you do. I hear it all the time, and it's a lot of money to buy into these practices, especially if they've been established for some time. But yes, a lot of people take out loans to buy into practices, but if it's good and planning on staying there for forever, it sounds like a very lucrative opportunity
Mhm.
if you're in the right place, right time.
Yeah, on the lawyer front, it's very similar. If you always hear of people being made partner, it means that you've hit a threshold where you have the experience, like the experience comes with that, right? You have to be trusted in the same manner that the owner trusts themselves. You're going to be managing um, other individuals. You're going to be managing finances. You're going to be bringing in revenue and profit sharing. And so, to that extent, you're also buying into the business. So, of course, I've never made partner. I've never been in a big firm or, even a mid-sized firm. I've had those discussions before at the smaller level and of what that looks like. But, I do have friends of mine who have made partner. And one of them actually made a joke. He said, now that I've had to buy into being a partner, I'm actually going to make less money for like the next 2 years than I would have if I just stayed not a partner. And that's because of the investment he has to make. But when it starts coming in and you're profit sharing, and if that firm is doing really, really well, you get the benefits of that. And that's one of the goalposts that a lot of lawyers reach for is if they're at a firm, they want to eventually be made partner. And there's junior partners or senior partners. There's the good old, hey, we're throwing your name on the door right along with everybody else's. And so that's why you'll
Like the show Suits.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's like you're throwing in and it's like Smith, Johnson, and Davis, and then all of a
Yep.
sudden you have another partner, and it's Smith, Johnson, Davis, and Stokowski. Like that's is eventually where you want to end up. But then you're helping to run a firm, not necessarily working in a legal capacity. So there are lawyers that when they hit that point, their job isn't doing grunt work and filing motions. They might show up to court a couple times a year. They might only show up for big clients, but a lot of their job is networking and bringing in the business, going to golf with potential clients and trying to lock in. Southwest Airlines is one of their big heavy hitters. So I think that's pretty interesting. And there's always going to be these goalposts, whether you're in med or law, that each person is going to try to reach because of how they view that area, how they view that field. And we've talked about before where it's like coming out of law school, it's, oh, you should do big law. You should try to do this. Oh, you should try to do that. And then there's areas that are frowned upon, but it's because of media and because of what people read in books and what they see on TV that kind of also pushes those goalposts on students without them truly comprehending what that means.
Yeah. The other interesting thing that I find as we're having this conversation is just how ingrained in our both of our careers paths that competition is kind of what drives and motivates people, right? Like to drive to like the way you motivate a physician is to cause them to compete with each other. It's just crazy, and I feel like especially in healthcare, that's not necessarily the right way to do it. But unfortunately, that's the system that we're currently in right now. But thinking of private practice, you're competing with the other practice in town. Whereas if you're in corporate, you have metrics and numbers that you have to try to meet every month, and so they're competitive realms so that physicians compete. I wonder if that's similar to the law world at all. Do you guys always have things that you're competing for or trying to be the best at? I mean, it sounds like it. It sounds like we have very similar, parallel journeys and goals. And
Yeah. In law school, it's funny because and it's one of the reasons why I chose the law school I went to because it was very family oriented in the sense of all the students felt like a family. But there are horror stories in law school of people hiding textbooks, ripping pages out of textbooks because they want any upper hand they can get over their fellow students. So there might be an exam coming up and there might be a few books in the library that have the answers to those exams and people got to study. So they'll take out the books and they won't return them or they'll rip the pages out. There is some sabotage that occurs in law school. And so it's only right that if that's the way you were trained for 3 years, that's how you're going to act when you get out. And I think that's why some people view lawyers as very cutthroat and rude at times and, excuse my French, but like assholes, right?
Mhm.
Because of the way that they have to compete for clients, compete in the courtroom. If you're in the courtroom, you're in a competition every day. You are arguing against two other individuals, the opposing counsel and in some instances the judge. And so you're constantly in a fight. And that can bleed over into your actual practice to where if you're looking for a fight all the time, well, when you get out of practice at the end of the day, you might still be in fight mode, or you might be so tired from fighting that that's the last thing you want to do. And you might be the nicest person in the world. So yeah, the competition is always going to be there. To your point, it's like that goalpost, that partner, it's not you just trying to reach partner, it's all the other people around you trying to reach partner. It's all the other people trying to compete for that one spot. And it's great when you're at the top and you're trying to build a cadre of like awesome individuals to be underneath you in your employment, but it's also kind of it can wear on you if you're constantly competing with your fellow peers. Now, another thing that you had mentioned that I want to go back to, which I thought was very interesting, was in private practice, you get to pick your own patients, right? It's very similar in the law where you get to pick your clients. So when somebody walks to the door for a client consultation, you can sit back in the end and say, actually, you know what? I'm sorry. Your case isn't for us. You as a person, we're not going to be a good fit. And that extends all the way up through big law, right? At the corporate level, the corporate law level, your client is the corporation. The corporation is hiring you to advise them. But in all other instances, you can pick your clients. Now, once you have your client and they're paying you, that changes the dynamic because it's not that easy to fire your client. Because not only do you have to deal with negative reviews on your law firm, anybody can write a Yelp review or a Google review, but you also have to deal with the fallout of what if you're in the middle of a court case and you're trying to fire your client? Well, that person then needs new representation. Sometimes judges won't let you off. Like there are certain filings that you have to file in court that say, I'm no longer representing said individual. And then new lawyer is now representing said individual. And it's called making an appearance. So it's very interesting how you can choose your patients and your clients at that level. But for you at like the corporate level, it sounds like that's not really an option. They show up in the door and you kind of have to work with them and that it is what it is.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to end the conversation. We've exhausted the pros and cons of both law and medicine going into corporate and private. And we talked about kind of the how we're cultivated or what we're taught in law school and med school and how we're exposed to certain areas and where things lead. So is there anything else that you wanted to add at all?
No, I think that just like every one of our topics, we can talk for hours on this topic and we can go more into detail. And for those that are listening, if you ever feel like you want more of a certain topic, you can always let us know. But that's all I have.
Well, then that's it for the episode here on the Medical Legal Brief, where medicine meets law. So if you liked what you've heard, share it, rate it, and give us a follow, please. Let us know what you want us to tackle next time here on the podcast with Dr. Long and Lawyer Nik.
Yes, we're doctors. Yes, we're lawyers. No, this podcast is not medical or legal advice. Do not take anything we say as a reason to perform your own heart surgery, represent yourself in court, or diagnose your neighbor's rash. This is for entertainment only. Think of it like hanging out with your smartest, wittiest friends, not a substitute for an actual appointment. If you act on anything we say without talking to your own professional, that's on you. Seriously, don't do that.